All right, everybody, that's it. Obviously, more time could be spent, but we have a compressed schedule today. So at least you've all resolved to make one little sacrifice, hopefully a significant one. All right, so Francis, you want this light as this in this way, or? Okay, Bob, we're ready for Francis. So, very happy to have Francis Donald's, just your attention, please. Francis Donald's presentation. Francis is many things, but an artist and an esoteric thinker, at least in our groups. And he has brought his art to the University of Seven Rays, Moria Federation, and all the full moon work, and we're very grateful to have his conceptions. Artistic, please, may I have your attention? Artistic conceptions that have so enriched our work. So without more ado, Francis. Okay.
Hello, it's such a privilege to be with you people. I have to say, at the risk of making the rest of my year sound mundane, this is really the high point for me. I just adore you people. So anyway, okay, with no further ado, we're using this light because I use a lot of my images, and these overhead lights tend to wash it out. So we're going to go with this arrangement. Okay. During that great initiation, which we call individualization, when we first sprang from a human womb, right, nurtured by the moon and Cancer, the seeds of another planetary influence had already been sown, right? For at the very beginning, when we initially came into form, we took on a mental body under the influence of Aries, right? During this process, there would have had to have been a massive reorganization of the three aspects of this animal man become human, right? Especially on the mental level, right? This restructuring was certainly influenced by Mars, because it's this planet that is actually capable of anchoring or grounding this fiery influence of Mars in the physical brain. But this conditioning didn't just happen many, many millions of years ago when, individualization, when we all came through together. It happens every time we incarnate, right? Because we take on a mental body every time we come into incarnation. So no matter what sign we're born into, those three aspects which make up our mental, astral, and physical bodies are conditioned by Mars's divine principle, which is called desire for form. It's an involutional principle, right? Thus, one of the names of this great Martian logos is the Lord of birth and generation. So this manifestation of the Martian logos is the exoteric ruler of Aries, right? A supreme center of involutional form-seeking force, right? This is right at the root of our incarnating, of the process of our incarnation. This influence is so powerful that we're held in its thrall for eons, right? And would be held even longer, except for the fact that this sixth-ray Martian energy, this involutional force, has in it what Alan Leo calls the unconscious quickener of the birth of the spiritual. The unconscious quickener of the birth of the spiritual. When we go looking for this quickening agent, we're led in an unexpected direction. The sense of taste. which Mars rules very specifically. Mars rules all the senses. We know this. But it's particularly related to this sense of taste. I mean, you can look at a piece of chocolate cake all day, right? But if you really want to have the Martian experience, you're going to bring the sense of taste in, right? So, but on the higher levels, this sense of taste manifests as astrally imagination. And mentally, on the mental plane, the manifestation of the sense of taste is discrimination. Put together, you have the discriminative imagination, which can get you into a lot of trouble, right? As a personality seeking gratification of the senses, the discriminating imagination can create new levels of sensory experience, right? But it also has the ability to release you through reorienting that which you direct your desire towards, right? So through the discriminative imagination, this exoteric Mars-dominated six-ray energy carries the seeds of its own destruction. It leads to destruction of the stranglehold that it has on our consciousness. Now, when these new energies begin to manifest, desire is still there because the senses, all the senses gratify desire, even at the higher levels. But the quality and nature of that which is desired is first assessed and then modified and eventually transformed. So, when the influence of any planet begins to demonstrate on a higher turn of the spiral within our own consciousness, such as Mars does through this redirected sense of taste, seems like an unusual connection, doesn't it? I mean, sense of taste, it's like the fourth sense. We don't really need it in order to survive. But if you think about it, what it requires in order to connect it to the imagination and discrimination, you start to see the sense of this connection. So anyway, when we use this sense on its higher levels, the esoteric influence of Mars begins to manifest in our lives. So this takes us from Mars as this fundamental conditioning, involutional potency, right, that we experience in Aries, to a Martian energy that serves a very different purpose. DK calls it the dominating factor of the tests and trials of the disciple. Of course, this is Mars in Scorpio, yes? Here we find the influence hugely expanded because it keeps its exoteric rulership, still holding the hold on the personality, but it now expands to include also its this esoteric rulership, which involves the unfolding path of the disciple. But this didn't quite sit right with me as I was thinking about it, because how can this involutional, form-seeking energy take us anywhere on the path of discipleship? And this is my own ideas, and so I stand to be corrected, but I think it can't. It doesn't. Because in the role of transformer, it doesn't work alone. And to find its companion, we have to go back to Aries again and look at the esoteric ruler. It also jumps up a notch when we move to Scorpio, to the hierarchical ruler. And I know you'll say, oh yeah, but the hierarchical ruler isn't felt until the third initiation. But in relationship to Mars, when this relationship is kept intact, they work together to create the evolutionary process. So, we have Mars, which oversees our birth into death, right? Generation. The slayer of the real. Kama manas and all its permutations. And then we have Mercury, which conditions the development of that which slays the slayer by mediating between the soul and the personality. Okay. All right. If we use this slinky, I think I can extemporize on this part. If we use this slinky to represent this path between Mars and Mercury, right? We could, let's say a time period that starts at the time of individualization down here, all the way up to the third or even the fourth initiation at this point. Mercury, which is represented by, let's say, the phoenix, that potency stands beyond this and is actually what's lifting this up, okay? And then Mars anchors this at the root. So if we look at it that way, we can say that each coil represents a lifetime. You know, it's really hard to find slinky manufacturers that know the average number of lifetimes between, you know, but so we have to do with this. So you can't count, right? Anyway, so if we further divide this in half vertically, the coils moving towards you, or towards you this way, could represent being in incarnation, and then the coils as they move away from you represent, you know, being out of form. Now, if we actually were to cut this slinky, then lifetimes would be a bunch of little pieces, which is how they tend to occur to us, right? Next life, last life. But it's not that way, and we actually know this, right? It's one thing. It's this process of becoming that begins here when we get our original equipment from Mars, right? This rotary motion, you know, this life force is content to demonstrate as the inherent energy in form, right? You know, it takes from its environment all it needs, which it unconsciously realizes is the Great Mother, right? Its three lower chakras are negatively polarized, so it's in a receiving mode. And this is as it should be. This lasts, as we know, for eons, until we get to a point where we just start to experience this influence from above. We enter into aspiration. You know, something else steps in. And then as we progress, we become disciples, pledged disciples, accepted disciples, right? And then we come to the levels of our initiations where a single lifetime, we make as much progress as we did through, you know, the entire period of our aspiration and early discipleship, right? So it's an increasing in its velocity. Okay. Well, about halfway through this point, there's some extremely significant life that occurs in Libra, we're told, where either we fall back into Virgo with Mercury as the exoteric ruler. Note that, right? And in a sense, reset to do the process again. Or we immediately reverse well, not immediately. We step into the process of reversing ourselves on the wheel, which leads to Scorpio, which is actually where the reversal demonstrates. The Libra is the balance point, but the reversal demonstrates in Scorpio, right? And of course, what happens? You immediately enter the tests and trials, right, on a higher level. Now, you know, for that period of time that is going to take you to the door of initiation, because, you know, Scorpio leads to Capricorn, right, to that door of initiation. That's, in a sense, the purpose. So we reverse our path on the wheel, right? This is strictly gratuitous. I just have to do this, you know. We reverse our path on the wheel. I should have put a chair here. We could have seen it. Anyway, okay. So one of the great things that happens with this is that, of course, when you finally reach the fourth initiation, the very molecular structure of that which was holding you when the personality is dissolved, as well as your causal body, and you escape the influence of the slinky forever and ever. So quite important. Okay, onward and hopefully upwards. Let's see where that takes us in this. Okay, DK tells us that the influence of Mercury as it relates to Scorpio is to inaugurate, and I think that's a key word, to inaugurate that final stage in consciousness which will place the soul within the form surely in the place of power. Okay, that's the inspiration for this piece, which I did in 2010. It's, there's a kind of Mercury and solar aspect combined at the level of the heart. And he's raised to the point to where he's achieved the fourth initiation. You know, he's escaped the slinky. In fact, this whole thing could be seen as a pictorial illustration of this metaphor, because at the bottom, can I use your pointer? You have it there? Down here at the bottom, you can kind of see this ruddy figure that has died. This is the personality that has descended to the bottom of the lake. You remember that fabulous old commentary? Let's see here. Up on this side? I'm challenged. Show me. Isn't it? Oh, is it? Oh, okay. Thank you. Hey. Okay. So this figure here, do you see it? Here's his head, and he's got his hands crossed here. It's very dim because the focus, of course, is the rising figure. You can even see a scorpion here crawling away, you know. The sting of the scorpion is self-induced, you know. At a certain point, the scorpion stings itself, which allows this process, metaphorically, allows this process to occur. So then his higher self rises up out, and he achieves the fourth initiation where he mounts the fixed cross. His eyes are on the monad at that point. Okay. And his hands are open in service. Anyway. Okay, thank you. So, let's see. As we move towards this goal, we oscillate between Mars, the bottom of the slinky, and Mercury, right? For eons, in fact, for what percentage of the career of a jiva? I don't know, but it's way up in the 90s for sure. You are under the form-building influence of Mars, right? Developing the three aspects of the personality and then finally integrating them. In fact, integrating the personality is no small task. And it's, you know, a sense, a supreme function of Mars with the influence of Mercury beginning to be felt even at that stage, because the first stage of the building of the Antakarana is the integration of the personality. We tend to forget that. We tend to think, oh, you know, I'm going straight for the soul. But integrating the three aspects of the personality is big stuff. It's a high achievement in its own right. So you have this period until you reach the level of aspiration and discipleship, at which time Mercury's influence comes in. And that's where, on the coil, you see the spiralic motion begin to take over, right? But Mars isn't done with you yet. At the third initiation, you face this energy along with the moon, and you have this fearful experience that's has to do with integrating the pairs of opposites, right? When you pass through the third initiation, you again step into the influence of Mercury that takes you up through the fourth initiation, where you're released absolutely from the influence of the personality. Don't die. There we go. Okay, moving right along. But this doesn't just happen on an individual basis. The chart shown here describes the progression of the globes of our Earth's chain as it moves from C, the Mars globe, and what do you think brings it down into D? The involutional potency, the form-seeking quality of Mars moves us down into this experience, which is a battleground between these two influences, because then, of course, immediately, or at the halfway point, the midway point, that all-important midway point, the influence of Mercury takes over, and we then have the opportunity to move back up into the sea globe. Now, this isn't only globes in a scheme, it's also, globes in a chain, it's also chains in a scheme, it's races in a globe. So this progression holds true whether we're looking at it macro or microcosmically. It's true in our individual lives in a very profound way, but it also takes us as a planet through the process. It's a fundamental transforming relationship, this influence of these two planets. Since we're in the fifth race of the fourth globe, we're just past that midway point, right? Atlantis was right at the densest of the dense. But now we've stepped on the other side. What does that remind you of? If we use Libra as the midway point, well, we've stepped into a Scorpio phase, right? Well, DK tells us that Scorpio and Mars energy are just alive and well all over the planet right now. Let's take a look at the tarot associated with Mars, with Mercury, and with Scorpio. Here we have the Tower. How many of you are familiar or have some working knowledge of the tarot? Oh, great. Oh, terrific. Oh, that's great. Okay, so Mars, the Tower. It depicts the destruction of some form, right? It's more likely to be astral and mental form than it is even physical form. The old commentary says, the way of the destroyer comes, the builder, and again the tearer down of forms. The broken forms hold not the power to satisfy. This illustrates the effect of double Mars in Scorpio, right? Because you have the building up, which is, that's unopposed in Aries. It's supposed to be doing this. It's rotary motion, it's form building. But then you also have this esoteric ruler effect in the tearing down. Okay. Mars's full name, is the Lord of birth and death, of generation and destruction. And these last two come in with the help of Pluto in Scorpio, because in this time, which, DK tells us, well, temporarily Pluto is involved. Well, temporarily can be 200,000 years, So you could almost include Pluto as a fundamental ruler, and I think many do, of Scorpio. The Tower becomes even more relevant when we discover that the arcanum associated with Scorpio is, come on, tarot guys. The arcanum that is related to Scorpio, here's a hint, yeah, death, right? And the picture becomes complete when we add Mercury's arcanum, the magician, and place it in this causal role. Okay, we now have Mercury, the hierarchical ruler of Scorpio, and the mediator between the soul and the personality, initiating the needed changes which work out in the three worlds of the personality via the Tower and Mars as a double ruler in that environment of Scorpio whose arcanum is death. I mean, can you just, It works. You know, it's interesting to look at the numbers involved in these three cards. For those of you not familiar with numerology, I just want to go over just a couple of concepts. Two things, really. When you have two numbers, like you do in the 16 of the tower, the first number, the first decan, the higher decan, the tens column, right, is often considered more causal than the second decan. In fact, in many cases, the second decan is the product or the manifestation of the first decan, right? And also, unlike in arithmetic, you can add the two together to get further insight into the numbers. So 7 becomes a very important part of 16, philosophically speaking, you know. Of course, there's a lot more to numerology in this, but for what I'm going to talk about, that will, you'll be able to understand everything I'm going to be referring to here. Okay, so we have the magician. His number is 1, and the tower's number is 16. The tower could be seen as a way of illustrating the effect of bringing the 1 of the soul, which is the magician, together with the 6 of the involutional aspect of the Martian manifestation of the sixth ray. In other words, the non-sacred exemplar of the sixth ray. Well, you bring these together, you know, the 6 by itself is no problem, even in a non-sacred way. But when you bring these two together, you tend to get this influence of Mars, right? Now, when you add the magician to the tower, you get 17, which is the star arcanum. Now, the star is most Taroists, not terrorists, Taroists, some maybe, well, anyway. They consider this is closely connected to Sirius. I can't explore that. It's a fascinating field. But if we look at the numbers of the star, the hierarchy is actually able to attune to Sirius through what sign? What sign? Through which sign does the hierarchy bring the energy of Sirius into its consciousness? Scorpio. Actually, the energy of Sirius comes to the hierarchy via Scorpio, right? Well, do the math. If you add the 1 and 7 together, you get 8. Scorpio is the 8th sign, and it's also the number of Christ, right? See the 8-pointed star there. Sirius is the cosmic second aspect, which is through which the Christ manifests. So numbers can lead you into interesting places, especially when you have this profound system of knowledge that the Tarot has given us. Okay. When reduced, let's see, also the 1 and the 7 give us an alpha omega in terms of its influence, right? All right, this shows I don't have time to go into this, but you can see, especially in the little triangle, the way that the energy comes to the Earth when seen as a distributing center. So back to death. There's an interesting phenomena that occurs with this number 13. If you take 12 globes and you position them around a central point, they create an invisible 13th globe. In other words, the edge of every one of those 12 globes. I did a mock-up in a 3D program to prove this, and it's true. There is, every one of these 12 globes touches this invisible 13th globe. I really get off on this kind of thing. I just love it, right? Because what you have here is this sphere of influence that's not in form. But it stands at the very center of the 12, right? What does this remind you of? The one in the center of the 12. You know, you see it with Christ and his disciples. You see it with Muhammad with his 12 imams, they're called, right? You could even look at the cosmic source of the 12 signs. You know, what is that 13th, which is really the one manifesting through the 12, you know. It's interesting because 13 is often associated with a mother, so you can see the one as giving birth to the 12 as having this feminine connotation. Okay, but when you're talking about Scorpio, you can never get too far away from death. A related concept we can find right in this card, which is, if you look at the first decan, the one, and if you think of that in terms of the soul, and then you look at the second decan as the three, that's the three aspects of our human form, they're separated. That's the true death experience. Because what you have is the soul immersed in form, right? The one is separate from the three because it's in the form world. So you have this kind of a reality, the four of form and the trinity of the, here, let me get in the light so you can see this. I should follow that advice more often, actually. So you have the reversed four, you know, the immersion in the form and the triangle of the arms, and then the one of the consciousness. You know, this, we could all be wearing these t-shirts all the time. You know, basically, here I am, a soul immersed in form. Hi, how are you? You know, because that's what's going on, right? And interestingly, it's the 12, which is the one directly before this, 13th. When you add 1 and 3 together, you get 4. Well, interestingly, even though Mars dominates in Scorpio as a 6th-ray potency, the energy coming through the actual constellation is 4th ray, right? So again, you have an identifier here with the 4th ray, not only of the constellation, but also of its hierarchical ruler with Mercury. DK has this marvelous quote, you know, on 4. We're told that 4 signifies the unification of the subjective and the objective principles, right? The 1 and the 3 come together to make 4. He says, man is no longer separative. He is the perfected 4 of the lower 3 and the soul. Okay, so finally, when you add the 3 cards together, has anybody done it yet? Yes, 30. Alice Bailey tells us that 30 represents the perfecting of the 3 aspects of the personality. So through this process, which is fundamental on the path of discipleship, you must achieve this perfecting of the 3 aspects. Well, numerologically, again, where is that 3? It's in the first decan. So that's this place of perfection, the more causal point, and the 0 holds the place. The ideas put forth in the Tarot are mirrored in the symbols that you usually see connected with Scorpio, right? The magician or spirit aspect is represented by the phoenix, and which is called the bird beyond space and time. That's because it's not in form. This is this Mercury influence, the soul influence. And more exoterically, the eagle. There's a kind of brain to mind connection between the eagle and the phoenix. The serpent takes the place of the tower, and in the slinky is this whole area in between, which is eventually going to stimulate the root chakra. And of course, the scorpion, which you can just see here, is through its lethal sting, is associated with death. But interestingly, the real action of the first of all, the scorpion, it protects itself from its environment, right? Bam, 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 bam. I'm taking on Lawson here. Bam, 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 bam. Right? And then, but at some point, there's this deeper process that comes in, and it turns the sting on itself. If you corner a scorpion, it'll kill itself before it will submit, right? There's this self-immolation is what is it's very connected with the base of the spine, it's what starts the process of moving the Kundalini energy. And it works from above downwards, right? So you're looking at the potency of the phoenix rising above Mars, free, finally. Okay. The serpent, which has at its heart the red star Antares, and Ophiuchus, is this guy here, which shows the personality wrestling this serpent, form two of Scorpio's constellations. The third is Hercules. Hercules and Scorpio. This is Hercules in his home territory because both represent the path of discipleship. Let's take a look at the Hercules labor. I love this old Greek vase. This has been around a long time, this labor. Do you all know the story of the eighth labor? I'll be very brief. Amemone went to Neptune. No, got to start at the beginning. There was a drought in Argos in ancient times. Amemone went to Neptune for help to relieve the drought. He bade her strike the stone. She did it. 3 crystal pure springs emerged. But soon a hydra took its home nearby in a cave of perpetual darkness, right? And it wasn't long after that the waters were polluted in the whole area, and what came to be known as the swamps of Lerna came forth. Well, the Argonians complained to the gods called on Hercules, and he went before his teacher, and the teacher said, go clean up that mess. So he came down, he slogged through the swamp, and he finally found the abode of the 9-headed Hydra. He tried to get it to come out, calling it names, and, your mom, but it wouldn't come out. So finally he dipped a bunch of arrows in pitch. It lit them up, and just a cloud of arrows, bam, 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 bam. I won't comment now. Anyway, so the Hydra issued forth, all pissed off, spitting and raging and breathing fire, right? So Hercules does what Hercules does. He took out his club and bow, wham, knocked off one of its head. That should do it. No, not anymore. That doesn't work here. Now we're on a new octave, right? Scorpio is the 8th sign. We're starting a new discipline here. When 2 grew in its place, he realized, ooh, I need help. So he remembered what his teacher said. Where did I set my thing? Oh, yeah. So he remembered what his teacher said, which was, I don't want to get the wording exactly right. We rise by kneeling. Notice the pairs of opposites. We conquer by surrendering. We gain by giving up. Well, so he waded into the swamp, knelt down, grabbed the Hydra, held it up over its head. The heads drooped. He pulled out his horn. Oh, wait a minute. The most important detail. Once the heads drooped and it was seen to be lifeless, a 10th head sprang out amidst the 9, hissing, spitting fire, as alive as ever. Hercules pulled out his sword, whacked off the head, took the head, buried it under a stone, and he completed very successfully the Scorpio labor. Okay, there's a lot of interesting details in the unfolding of this myth. The story starts with a drought, which was alleviated by Neptune, right? The sacred exemplar of the sixth ray. This seems to me, and the way he alleviated it was to create these 3 pure crystal springs. This seems to me to be an allusion to the fact that originally the 3 planes of human existence were not contaminated. It wasn't until the Hydra moved in, which is, and enclosed itself in this cave of perpetual darkness. Well, what is that? That's us not connecting to our soul, right? It's not a nice place to be. When Mars reaches a certain point, the next stage is soul influence. In that interim, you have this cave experience. And pretty soon the entire land is polluted, right? You see this image of the unregenerate personality in all kinds of mythology. For instance, the Minotaur in the mazes beneath Gnosis. It's not Philadelphia, right? It's Gnosis. It's the higher mind, right? It's beneath that level, sealed off from that influence. Okay, and you also find it in all these myths about dragons who, store their gold and maidens and, anything else they might want down underground, right? And in recent times, and I love this myth, you have Gollum, who's completely held in thrall by what you could only describe as the personality on steroids, right? Here's the one ring that binds them all. This poor little thing who was just a guy, and suddenly he's made into this monstrous being, who hides underground because he's under the thrall of what we're all under the thrall of. Fortunately, it's not as strong as the one ring, Well, and then, even things like seemingly more superficial stories, like Darth Vader in his black helmet in the middle of his Death Star, right? What's that about? It's the same story. He's closed off from the light. Do you remember, sci-fi junkies like myself, but at the end, he takes off the helmet and he's this sort of, unattractive guy blinking at the light, But, geez, at least he's released from the horror of that one period. Okay. So, God, I got to move more quickly. So just as Frodo and Gollum had to find the source of the binding ring in order to destroy it, remember, they had to go into the land of Mordor, death. They had to climb Mount Doom, right? And this was the source of the personality. It's at the deepest levels of death. It's this space. It's this original rotary motion still influencing the jiva, right? This kind of space. And only there could it be dissolved back into its primordial elements, right? Taken out of form. Well, just like Frodo and Gollum had to do that, Hercules had to find the root of his disharmony in order to destroy the power that held from any further progress. But before Hercules could do this, even before he could get started on the labor itself, he had to wade through the muck, find the dark cave, and then try to get the Hydra to come out. This, even though it's very short in the myth itself, it represents an essential preliminary stage, which is recognition of that which has to be transmuted. It's what Michael was getting us to do. Any one thing. Hey, you're gonna wash up after you drink a glass of water. Something. Come on, give me a token of this process, right? Which is recognition of that which must be transmuted, and the willing to track down those personality flaws, right? Recognition, it's the preliminary stage, right? Well, DK gives us a list of 9 problems connected with each plane, right? Physical plane, astral plane, mental plane problems, which together make up the 9-headed Hydra. If we were to meditate and do retrospective writing on each of those 9, that would be one way of recognizing our personal Hydra. We would make some connection there. And this is what Hercules was doing when he rained this cloud of fiery arrows. What is that? It's Sagittarius, right? Fiery arrows. I mean, into this cave. Finally, this Hydra's like, what the heck, And he comes out. Then there's the recognition. Man, oh my God, it's even worse than I thought, Well, but this process won't defeat the Hydra. It's not going to take him down. That just gets him out into the light. But I'll get to that in a minute. Let's go back to Aries for a minute. The reason for Hercules' near failure in Aries, BL, wherever you are, pointed out, was hubris. But in the earlier stages of the labors, right? This was his very first labor. It was still allowed. You could still complete the labor in spite of that kind of grievous mistake. No more. Now we're one octave up, and it's a whole new ballgame in Scorpio, right? In fact, the use of Hercules' traditional methods, which is just hit it really hard, man, just has the opposite effect. The use of oppositional force, which he depended on up to this point, he uses that a lot in his labors. Very martial. Only serves to intensify the problem. Two heads grow in the place of one. So heeding the words of his teacher, he drops his club. That alone was a huge thing, just to let go of the club, right? And he wades into the swamp, which he now recognized he made, and he kneels down in this stench and raises the Hydra above his head. And, as soon as he dropped his club in a way, it was a victory. It was a done deal. I once knew a man, an American man, who, while visiting a village in Guatemala, was selected as the successor of this shaman that lived in this village. This is unprecedented. This never happens, right? It happened. So even more extraordinary, this man decided to do it. And he stayed there 17 years. He became the successor of this local shaman. The first thing he had to do was walk up and down the streets of this village, proclaiming at the top of his lungs every evil, every negative act, thought that he'd ever had. 2 days, 2 full days, and the residents are going, oh my God, it must be time for a new shaman, here. Because that's the tradition, right? Well, this is like a crash course in humility, right? I mean, talk about holding up your own Hydra. That's one way. I mean, when you speak, it's into the light and air of consciousness, But we all have to find our own way of doing this, of lifting our selfishness. I don't recommend the Guatemala approach. It's, you might end up just with an upset stomach. Okay. So we're left with what is arguably the most fascinating detail of the 8th labor. Quote, only when the heads did lifeless lay did Hercules perceive the mystic head that was immortal. What is this immortal head, that Hercules dispatches and buries? What's that all about? The numbers involved are interesting because we have the 9 and the 1, right? In the Tetractys, the 1 is not just one more of the 10. It's not just the first one of the 10. It's the source of the 9, right? Pyramids are truncated. That is, they don't have this top part on the physical plane. That's because this 1 is beyond physical manifestation. It's the source of the 9. Well, that's what we have here with the mystic head. It's the source of the 9 manifesting evils of the Hydra, right? Why does it work to cut off one or to club to death one of the heads? Because the source is unaffected by that. It just goes, hey, no problem, right? I'll just make another head. In fact, here's 2. So you have to get to the source of the head itself. So I thought about this for quite a while. What's that all about? What's this detail about? He buries this mystic head under this stone. It's really fascinating, you know. Well, here's one possibility. The only protection from this conquered influence is to have risen to a place on the path where there's nothing left in one's consciousness that resonates with the vibration represented by that head. Then its energy lies below the threshold of the initiate consciousness. The tombstone of the immortal 10th head might represent this threshold, right? Is that 10th head dead? No, it's alive and well throughout the world. The initiate lives and works in the world. That hissing, fire-spitting head is ever present all around him. But if there's nothing in the initiate who is responding to that vibration, it lies below its own threshold and is safely there. I'm really pressed, if you don't mind. Okay, this is an Egyptian stele from the late period of Egyptian times. This actual piece was made sometime between the time of Christ and 300 AD. The figure on this is, here. It's also here. You can see it. If you can't see this, you can see this. It's Heru Pa Kared is the name of this piece, which means the young Horus, and is a prototype of Hercules. The H-E-R in Hercules, which is normally attributed to Hera, the Queen of Heaven who had, Hercules was a favorite of hers, I think actually comes from Heru, which is the name of Horus, the sun god of Egypt. What we have here is this in-between space, which is Hercules. You know, God was a father, its mother was is us in incarnation. You know, it's this solar place between the pairs of opposites. So he was known as the god of the rising sun, right? That's what we're all doing. We're rising. And peculiarly also as the god of silence. He's often depicted this way, right? With his finger to his lips. Okay, we know that to be silent is the fourth of four great commands that relates to the four arms of the fixed cross. To will, to know, to dare, and to be silent. And that to be silent is particularly related to Scorpio. Now, DK makes a point of telling us that to be silent has nothing to do with not speaking. This is really important, you know. People just say, oh, okay, I'll just shut up. I can do that. No. It is rather connected with thought control and to the inner redirecting of one's energies. And, you know, I found in this next quote what really might help us slay that hydra. DK tells us, or it's at least lifted up out of its swampy element. He tells us certain lines of thought, this is directly connected with the teaching on silence. Certain lines of thought are refused admission. Certain habits of thinking are eradicated. And certain approaches to ideas are not developed. This is done by a process of substitution and not by a violent process of suppression. This is the last detail is so important. You substitute Mercury, you substitute the soul aspect rather than trying to, you know, you're not going to suppress Mars. That's the cutting off of the head and getting two in its place. It won't work, right? As he continues to develop this theme on silence, we learn that it's a key element in moving the energy from the six-petaled sacral center, notice the number, which is ruled by Mars, to the 16-petaled throat center, which on the fixed cross is conditioned by Neptune. So, you know, we're moving again from the non-sacred to the sacred exemplar of the sixth ray. DK says to be silent is a means of transmuting the lower creative energy into the higher creative life. Lower creative energy, higher creative life. The sacral center has to relapse into silence. The results of this creative work which must be carried to the point of effectual demonstration in Scorpio, in which sign the final tests are applied to prove that the energy, and here's the kicker, that the energy is flowing freely from the throat to the sacral center. It's not about shutting down any of the chakras. It's about where you move the place of control. And if this energy is controlled from this place, then you're centered in your creative life aspect. Now, for the ancient Egyptian occultists, all of that was indicated just with this: silence. Now, this stele, which I'll come back to it here, emphasizes another aspect of the young Heru. Here we see him poised between two forces, right? Got it. Oh, 10 minutes, great. Okay. On his right, we see the god Horus, right here, which represents the second aspect, the solar principle, right? On his left, we have the powers of duality, you see here, which is, all the classic pairs of opposites, right? Spirit and form, light and darkness, soul and personality. So he stands between those, the midway point, the famed midway point. In ancient Egypt, mastering the pairs of opposites gave the initiate what was called the double power. And this is illustrated by the fact that he's standing on two alligators. Interestingly, those two alligators became the two fishes in the Piscean Age, right? But at this point, it was still Aryan influenced, even though this piece was actually probably built in the beginning of the Piscean Age. The Aryan era still ruled in the thinking. So it was alligators. And there were plenty of alligators in Egypt. This power signifies identification with the solar aspect, which allows one, for instance, to pick up poisonous snakes. He's holding these snakes. Now, this is a key element because these snakes, which represent the power of death, link Heru, which is this little guy, Heru Pakred, with Hercules, who as an infant also liked to strangle snakes, And here he is, already dealing with the pairs of opposites. That just means that he came into this incarnation already gifted with that level of consciousness, right? Where he'd passed these tests. But it's this great magician goddess, Selket, the group, Selket, who rules over the poisonous and venomous creatures, including snakes and scorpions. She rules over it. So what does that tell you? She's a guide. She is a guide in the scorpion. This is a scorpion on top of her head, right? Which means that force crowns her, starts in the spine, takes her all the way up to the head chakra. This is your guide in the dark world of Scorpio. Now, the little comic face, let's get back here. This little comic face is only comic in its depiction because this represents Heru's teacher. And it was he who would have instructed Hercules, we rise by kneeling, we conquer by surrendering, we gain by giving up. Okay, kneeling, conquering, surrender, giving up are all associated with the scorpionic concept of death. The term death, as it's used in the ancient wisdom teachings, can be divided into three distinct areas or categories. The most exoteric use of the term relates to death as annihilation, as the enemy of existence, right? Addressing this idea, which is also humanity's greatest fear, DK says simply, there is no death. The second use of the term is characterized by the idea of the lovely secret of death, which is entrance into life. This invariably refers to transcending the form aspect, right? Now that form can be just the release from a thought form that's been holding you down for some years, Or it can be this traditional idea of death, which is released from the three aspects of the personality. Or it can be that final death, which is released from the entire influence of the personality. Finally, we have a third perspective, which describes death from the soul's point of view. When the soul incarnates, when it immerses its life force in the world of form, it is said to be following the path of death. When considering death as a negative, this is death. Or more accurately, a true demonstration of sacrifice. You know, we normally think of the height of sacrifice as being willing to give our lives for some noble cause. Well, the impulse to sacrifice is there, but all that happens is that you emerge into a greater sphere of life. But true sacrifice is when the life force moves in the other direction, not released outwards, but is confined inwards. That's what this is all about, you know. Okay, this process. And of course, the greatest sacrifice of all is Sanat Kumara, who abides on the etheric levels of the physical plane. So we can conclude that how death occurs to us is a matter of how we perceive the direction of the flow of energy, right? At an even higher level, we see that death is really just two poles of the same phenomena. In rays and initiations, we're told that death is simply an effect produced by life, right? And then he has this incredibly occult sentence, which is, it's a mode whereby the adept directs substance and controls matter. But the fear of death, which DK describes as one of the greatest abnormalities or distortions of divine truth, for which the lords of cosmic evil are responsible, must be met and overcome by the disciple who passes through the trials of Scorpio, before he can enter into death's more profound secrets. Each successive death opens a way to a new understanding of life. In my opinion, this new understanding of life is the true secret of death. The death just takes you to that place where you can understand the secret. In Scorpio, this secret is accessed by death through suffocation, which characterizes, as we know, the death of the personality and leads to the hierarchy. But why suffocation? We're not told, but we could hypothesize that at some supreme point of crisis, the jiva is lifted to a very high point and is able to see that which has been created through his desire nature, you know, all the desires of the possessions on the physical plane and the glamours and desires on the astral plane, have suffocated the life aspect, right? So he gains this perspective, which is, by the way, these 4 tarot cards, which are the 10s, represent this state of excess or density. And I'm going to have to fly through this part. When we view death cyclically, it moves from the 10 to the 1. I mean, just think numerically, 1 plus 0 is 1, right? You die, elements return to their essential nature, which is represented by the aces. But when we move linearly, we move from the 10, or that field of endeavor, which has taken us into density, into the court cards, which is the first one is number 11, so we move from 10 to 11. That's because the court cards represent the consciousness aspect, whereas the numbered cards represent the form aspect. Okay. At the level of the 10s, we have what's called the Ancient One dying by drowning, right? Such is the test. The waters envelop him and there is no escape. He drowns and descends to the bottom of the lake. The bottom of the lake represents that cusp that follows the 10s, where we can go no further. Okay, give me 2 minutes. Once the jiva rejects this greatest point of densification, the world of form, personified by Mother Earth, reacts, and the next phase of his process or initiation kicks in. The heat of the earth, this is a very occult statement, the fiery temper of the mother destroys the form, releases the soul, and so the lesser self is killed. The density of this environment conditions, represented by the 10, provide an opportunity for the jiva to overcome, to bridge the gap to the 11. Okay? Now, if we take a closer look at this death by Scorpio, we find that the airless, the quality of air, which is the nature of suffocation, is actually Buddhic, right? Because Buddha, air is the symbol of the Buddhic plane. So it's a kind of divine airlessness that occurs, where through the awareness of the impact of the personality, the jiva feels suffocated in terms of this divine quality of air. But then, one more statement, but then our story leads to a place behind the veil. Possibly the Scorpio goddess could tell us what happens at the bottom of the lake where water and earth meet. What divine alchemy triggers Mother Earth's release of the soul from the bondage of form? In other words, how does the 10 become the 11? We suspect some form of intercession, but of course, this kind of, Selkit is not speaking, right?
Thank you.
Thank you.